Now, I'm going to start this video out by taking us back in time several years, back to the 2015 San Diego Comic-Con, where they had a Q&A session with the cast and crew of the upcoming The Force Awakens, and someone asked if there would be any mention of Darth Plagueis, and maybe in regards to a staff we'd seen Rey using or having in some of the marketing, and this is the response we got.
Hi, my name is Jonathan.
And what is your question, Jonathan?
Is there going to be any mention of Darth Plagueis in Episode 7, maybe surrounding a certain staff that someone finds?
Oh. Is that...
Larry? You want to answer that?
I don't think I heard correct. Is it Darth Vegas? Like Las Vegas? Darth Vader?
No, Larry's messing with you. I don't think we don't want to be talking about story too much too soon, but I will say no.
Okay, so first of all, it needs to be noted that yes, these are the two guys who wrote Episode 7 of the Star Wars saga, and they don't seem to even know who Darth Plagueis is, or at least Lawrence Kasdan doesn't seem to. And I know some people have said he's joking around here, and even J.J. Abrams says here in the clip that he is, but I'd argue he seems pretty clueless when he starts going on about Darth Vegas, and if he's that good of an actor, maybe he should have been in the films. Furthermore, it's kind of hard to determine if J.J. Abrams knows one way or the other who Plagueis is here. He did sort of defer the question instead of just giving a straight no. He also did claim years later, shortly before The Rise of Skywalker came out, that the Opera House scene, where Palpatine of course tells Anakin the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, that it was actually his favorite scene from the prequels, so who knows. Maybe it became his favorite scene after finally watching the prequels for the first time after he was done making Episode 7. And I'm joking, I hope. And look, in defense of Lawrence Kasdan here, he did write The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, so it's not that I'm claiming he doesn't know Star Wars at all, when in reality he played a big part in originally creating it and turning it into what it is today. Still, you could certainly argue it's a little odd that the guy who co-wrote Episode 7 doesn't remember one of the most iconic, not to mention intriguing, scenes from the prequels. And so I actually think this kind of leads to a series of interesting questions, the first of which being, how well should someone have to know the property or franchise they're writing in? How well should they know the lore, essentially? And one of the reasons I ask this is because we recently learned that the lead writer for WandaVision, that being Jack Schaefer, is not a comic book fan at all. She even admitted she doesn't digest the stories in comics very well, and that she has trouble following them, saying she doesn't know what cell to look at next, which right away tells a comic book fan she isn't one because they're called panels, not cells. I mean, that's basically the equivalent of unironically calling a lightsaber a laser sword, though to her credit in the interview that she talked about all this, she does acknowledge that for Marvel fans hearing that she's not a big comic book fan herself, that it might be disappointing. Though I don't necessarily know if disappointed is the word I'd choose. I'm more along the lines of surprised because, for not knowing comics, she managed to write quite the series, one that most seem to really like and enjoy, until maybe the last couple episodes and especially the ending, where some started to take issue with things or felt let down, mainly because I think a lot of people were waiting for a bigger punch or reveal at the end. And of course there was the whole promise of a Luke in the Mandalorian level appearance, which didn't happen and was actually meant to be sort of a joke, one started by Paul Bettany, who talked about how he was getting the chance to work with an actor he'd always admired and wanted to work with, and it turned out he was, again jokingly, talking about working with himself because two different versions of Visions would of course encounter each other, which meant he'd basically have to work opposite himself. Anyway, even without the promise of that big reveal, there was or would have been plenty of speculation about who was going to show up in the series or what was really going on, with many people thinking there was some larger villain behind everything, someone like Mephisto, for example. Problem with that is Jack Schaefer didn't even know who Mephisto was, and so all the little clues people thought they were picking up on as the show went on were actually completely inadvertent. In fact, many, if not almost all of them, all these little things people were seeing or figuring were clues, were never intended to be anything of the sort. And as someone who likes to tell a story or two himself here on this channel and breaks them up into parts or episodes, there have certainly been times between episodes that people saw something as a clue that I never intended to be one, or that came up with a theory as to where the story was going that's, well, maybe even better than what I had in mind. I also, during one of my reviews for an episode of WandaVision, shared a story about a D&D group that I'm the DM of and how the players took what was meant to be an obscure detail about some soup, of all things, that was added just for some flavor, no pun intended, and they blew the whole thing up into something epic and completely went off in a different direction. So in my own small ways, I suppose, I can understand the other side of this, though I certainly don't have literally millions of people who are watching my stories, of which there are many analyzing every little detail and then crafting and putting out there on the internet their own theories or building on the theories or observations of others until people are, again, coming up with these truly amazing and intricate stories and ideas that would tie beautifully in with all the lore, and that the show could be construed to be alluding to, but actually isn't. Because sometimes mentioning your husband Ralph on multiple occasions isn't a clue that you're working for or with the devil, you're just talking about a guy named Ralph who happens to have lived in the house you essentially hijacked, though yes, he was a character who would have a unique part to play in not only the show itself, but in all the theories that popped up around it. And so sometimes it's not the little things that get misinterpreted, sometimes big things get very intentionally put in there, which leads you to all but be positive it has to mean something, but actually doesn't. And bringing in Evan Peters to play Wanda's brother was one of those things. And he of course played essentially the same character or played a different version of Quicksilver in the X-Men universe. And so this seemed to imply a link of some kind between the two, or that at the very least it was leading to some sort of really big reveal. And so I'll admit, as someone who is very aware sometimes clues aren't really clues and sometimes Easter eggs are just that, Easter eggs with no greater meaning, I bought the whole thing hook, line, and sinker and thought for sure this would have to be the key to bringing the X-Men into the MCU. That part of the point of the whole show WandaVision was to, shall we say, lay the foundation as to how that would eventually happen. I mean, why else would you get that particular actor unless you had some sort of grand plan for him? Certainly they wouldn't do it just to be played as a boner joke. However, in all reality, and for better or worse depending on what you thought of it, the show was never meant to be, shall we say, that large in scale. It was never meant to be about the X-Men or bringing in Mephisto. It was always meant to be about Wanda and Vision. It was really about how one woman dealt with her grief, and grief you could argue was the real villain of the show, and how she becomes the Scarlet Witch. That was it. That was really all the show was ever meant to be or tried to be. And once that sort of dawned on some at the very end, they felt let down because they were convinced a much bigger ending awaited them after all these clues, which really weren't clues, had been pointed out to them and all these theories presented to them. Though that said, yes, I've certainly heard from some who didn't like the ending or even the whole series for other reasons entirely, and others still who thought the whole thing was fantastic from start to end and have absolutely no complaints. Everyone is free to make up their mind and to feel how they want about any or all of WandaVision. Either way here though, yes, there were certainly some who were expecting much more from the end than we actually got, and probably got their hopes up for this or that to happen because after each and every episode, there were again people putting some pretty fun and exciting theories out there. Some of them you could argue were or would have been maybe even much better than what we actually got. There were some pretty epic and elaborate story ideas that would have blown some minds, no doubt about it. But, and again going back to The Force Awakens a bit here, and as someone who spent a lot of time coming up with theories after that movie came out and making videos about them, I always had a saying that the simplest theory was the one most likely to be correct, because the more elaborate it is, the more it relies on lore that the average viewer is not going to know or understand without a heck of an explanation within the story, the less likely it is to happen. And as a lot of you likely remember, every little thing in The Force Awakens, much like what happened with WandaVision, was being scrutinized and analyzed and then used as evidence to come up with or support a theory. And in that case, in the case of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, it didn't turn out to matter pretty much at all because there was, as Rian Johnson himself had said, a full handoff between the films. He was able to do whatever he wanted with The Last Jedi. It didn't matter too much what J.J. Abrams had done with The Force Awakens, what clues he may or may not have put in there. And though pretty much every theory being wrong wasn't even close to the only reason why many fans didn't like The Last Jedi, I think the hype they all generated, or the fact that fans came up with some pretty truly outstanding theories, certainly didn't help the situation, especially since Rian Johnson seemed almost hell-bent on subverting expectations and proving all those theories to be wrong. And one can only imagine what sort of shape the Star Wars fan base would be in right now if Johnson hadn't done Episode 8, if instead someone more interested in digging into the lore and really trying to make something more cohesive that felt like a bigger part of the overall story, if they had made the film instead. But I digress, because I do think there is a very fine line between a story that goes deep enough into the lore to appease the more hardcore fan, and yet is easy enough for anyone to understand and follow along with and enjoy. Though you do have to keep in mind that another goal is to turn that general audience member into a genuine fan. You want them to become vested in the bigger story or lore, and go back and learn more about it and check out your other stories, which, if you're the creator or the owner of the property, hopefully means they'll go back and buy those stories, and then also buy future ones. In other words, I absolutely believe you don't want to avoid your lore, and that you really want writers who can work in it and know it pretty well. That you actually want them to dig into it as much as they possibly can get away with, even at the risk of maybe slightly confusing some, because a lot of the time that confusion leads to intrigue, if your story is good of course, and it leads to people wanting answers instead of walking away. Which is not to say that's necessarily what WandaVision should have done. In my opinion, it was a pretty solid story start to finish and did actually incorporate quite a bit of lore when you really stop and think about it. Though yes, as I said before, I did think and kind of expect and certainly hope for a link to the X-Men in the series, especially when they brought in Evan Peters to play Wanda's brother, or Wanda's fake brother. And maybe, ironically enough here, though it's anecdotal, the person I personally know who was most disappointed with the ending of WandaVision was someone who's a casual fan of the MCU at best, and knows little to nothing about the comic book lore behind it, yet got so into the show they started to binge watch videos on YouTube, and learned everything you ever wanted to know about the Scarlet Witch and other characters, and a lot more. And they got so excited about being in the know and waiting for some sort of big reveal that they'd be in on, that they were hugely disappointed when it didn't happen. Well, that's all I've got for you this time, but this is once again one of those times I'm really curious to hear or read what you all have to say, because I've seen a lot of people who were very disappointed with the ending of WandaVision, and so I'm curious why that is. Did you think the ending should have been bigger, or did you think it should have been executed better? And who do you think these shows should cater more to? The fans in the know, or those who are pretty clueless? Or how do you walk that fine line between the two? How do you make a non-fan into a fan? Do you bombard them with the lore, or what? Whatever the case may be here, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars and some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.